The date is the 10th of May, 1945. The time is 03:17 in the morning. The place is 100 meters beneath the surface of the frigid Norwegian Sea, off the coast where the fjords carve deep black scars into the European continent. It is an abyss of pressurized silence. Here in the belly of the Type 7 U-boat, U-977, the world is reduced to the whisper of recirculating air and the slow, deliberate pulse of the electric motors. The atmosphere is thick, heavy, and metallic, carrying the unavoidable tang of diesel fumes, sweat, and ozone from the batteries, a potent chemical cocktail that defines the existence of the Kriegsmarine's deep-sea warrior. A single, muffled clang resonates through the steel pressure hull. It is not the impact of a depth charge, but the sound of a hand wrench turning on a forgotten, non-essential valve. In the tiny control room, the only light comes from the hooded, red lamps necessary for preserving night vision, or perhaps, simply, for preserving sanity. A faint, continuous vibration shudders through the deck plating, a tactile reminder that the boat is moving, defying the final overwhelming command of history. The U-boat is not scuttling, it is fleeing. The moment itself is an inversion of history. While above them, across the breadth of the defeated Third Reich, millions celebrated or mourned the cessation of 5 years of total war. Here, Commander Oberleutnant zur See Heinz Schäfer stood staring at a chart illuminated only by the brief sweep of a pencil light, plotting a course for a war that, for them, had yet to truly end. This specific, desperate moment, the subsurface flight of U-977, is where the grand, sweeping narrative of World War II collapses into the sharp, confined tragedy of individual choices. Historical context: the collapse of command. To understand the audacity and the despair of the U-977's subsequent 85-day voyage, one must first grasp the catastrophic finality of May 1945. For 5.5 years, the U-boat arm, commanded first by the indomitable Admiral Dönitz, had been the sharpest, most relentless spear of the German war machine, a force of ideological purity and technological terror that had at one point brought Great Britain to the absolute brink of starvation. Its crews were the elite young men steeped in the rigid discipline of the Reich, sworn to the bitter end of its ideals. But the end, when it came, was not a Wagnerian climax. It was a whimper of broken radio silence. On May 4th, Admiral Dönitz, acting as the designated successor to a deceased Führer, issued Operation Regenbogen, Rainbow. The order was simple, profound, and final. Scuttle all U-boats. Deny the enemy the fruits of German ingenuity. Sink them in the deepest available water, and allow the crews to become prisoners of war. It was intended as a final, desperate act of defiant, if mandated, honor. Across the Atlantic, thousands of men followed this order, flooding their ballast, tanks, and climbing into life rafts to surrender to the overwhelming power of the Allied forces. The war was done. But for the men of U-977, stationed off the coast of Norway, the order arrived not as a clear directive, but as a crisis of conscience in the confines of a steel tube. Schäfer, a young officer of 24, had gathered his crew of 47 men, veterans, technicians, and boys barely out of school, and presented them with a choice. To surrender immediately in a Norwegian port meant certain captivity, perhaps interrogation, and the ignominy of defeat. To scuttle the boat meant abandoning their last symbol of national purpose. He offered a third option, an option born of denial and desperate hope, an option that the official historians of the Kriegsmarine would later have to carefully excise from the record: to sail to Argentina. Argentina, a neutral nation, was the last sliver of the globe where surrender might mean asylum, not imprisonment, where the end of the war might not mean the collapse of all ideological structure. This choice, to flee rather than submit, transformed U-977 not into a ghost ship, but into a coffin of ambition, setting off for a future that neither their training nor their ideology had prepared them for. Emotional contrast, discipline versus despair. The German soldier, be he a U-boat ace or a grenadier, was trained to expect a clean war, a swift victory, or a swift, honorable demise. The psychological architecture of the Wehrmacht and the Kriegsmarine was built upon rigid certainty, where every action had a predefined consequence and where the hierarchy of command was sacred. The expectation, even in defeat, was order. But the experience of U-977 became the very antithesis of this expectation. It was a plunge into psychological disorder, a descent into a gray, liminal space where command was arbitrary, and the enemy was no longer a distant destroyer, but the very air they breathed. Schäfer's decision split the crew. 16 men, the older, more pragmatic contingent, opted for the immediate, inevitable surrender in Norway, and they were put ashore. 31 men, the youngest, the most committed, or perhaps simply the most afraid of Allied retribution, chose the absurd voyage into the South Atlantic. They expected a difficult, dangerous transit, yes, but one culminating in a swift, celebratory landfall in a sympathetic foreign nation. What they received was the claustrophobic realization that their world was now 90 feet wide and 6 feet high, and that outside this damp, dark volume of steel, the war, and their reason for being, had evaporated entirely. The contrast was stark. The German sailor expected the rhythmic precision of duty. He experienced the crushing monotony of perpetual flight. Inside the U-boat, the crew was forced to adopt a radical, exhausting regimen necessary for the intended 66-day, uninterrupted underwater transit. To avoid detection by the omniscient Allied air patrols that now owned the skies, the boat would run almost entirely submerged, utilizing the newly introduced yet temperamental snorkel. The snorkel was a breathing tube, a mast raised just above the surface to draw fresh air for the diesel engines and exhaust the toxic fumes, all while keeping the boat just beneath the waves. It was a technological marvel, but a sensory nightmare. The engines, which previously roared to life only for high-speed dashes on the surface, now became a constant, low, rhythmic hammering directly above the crew's heads, a sound that drove sleep away and gnawed at the nervous system. When the snorkel was retracted, in heavy seas, or during the crucial silent periods, the electric motors took over. The atmosphere would immediately begin to sour. Oxygen dwindled, carbon dioxide climbed. The air became thick, inducing headaches, a sluggishness of thought, and a persistent, damp chill that soaked into the bones and never left. The psychological defense mechanisms of the disciplined sailor, routine, cleanliness, order, began to crack under the relentless pressure of that fouled air. They expected ideological clarity and purpose. They experienced an ideological void filled only with the mechanical drone of their engine and the rising fear that they were committing the ultimate act of futility. Symbolism, the taste of orange marmalade. In the closed ecosystem of the U-boat, where every calorie was measured and every sensation was dulled by the pervasive cold and damp, the concept of abundance was a theoretical absurdity. Rations were minimal: tinned meats, hard biscuits, and, critically, ersatz coffee and synthetic jams. The reality of wartime Germany had long been defined by deprivation, rationing, and the grim necessity of substitution. The symbolic object that represented the world they had destroyed and the luxury of the democracy they fled was the simple, sweet, and vividly real taste of orange marmalade. Not the official Kriegsmarine jam, a thin, translucent artificial pectin, but the authentic, chunky, golden spread of the Allied world. Perhaps it was a memory from a captured British freighter's provisions, or a luxury pilfered during a brief, early war foray into an occupied port. It existed only as a concept, a memory or a dream in the cramped, humid air of U-977. It was the taste of unrationed sugar, of foreign-grown fruit, of an economy so vast and secure that it could afford to put such a rich, unnecessary sweetness into a naval ration. Narrator: in the suffocating dark of the forward torpedo room, where the air was coldest and the fear most palpable, the men would sometimes speak in hushed, low tones about breakfast. Not the meal they were eating, the gray, repetitive paste of their exile, but the breakfast of their dreams, a thick slab of real, unsalted butter and the sharp, bright zest of orange marmalade. The marmalade became the symbol of a freedom they could not articulate, the freedom from scarcity, the freedom to choose, the freedom that existed outside the rigid, self-denying confines of their ideological state. It was the antithesis of the synthetic, predictable existence they had pledged their lives to uphold. This symbol would recur, a small, persistent ache of desire, throughout the long, featureless transit of the deep ocean. Historical evidence: the log of the longest dive. The journey was not a single, reckless dash. It was a grueling, calculated feat of endurance and technical seamanship, a demonstration of German engineering pushed to its absolute breaking point. The first and most critical phase was the evasion of the Allied dragnet that instantly blanketed the North Atlantic following the official surrender. Scheffer knew that surface travel was suicide. His strategy was novel: to remain submerged for as long as the batteries and the crew's sanity would allow. U-977 departed Kristiansand on May 10th. For the next 17 days, the boat remained permanently underwater. This was a sustained dive previously unheard of in naval history. Factual data: the standard Type 7C battery capacity was designed for approximately 80 nautical miles at a slow, submerged speed of 4 knots. The use of the snorkel allowed the diesel engines to run while submerged, both powering the boat and recharging the batteries simultaneously. Yet the constant raising and lowering of the snorkel mast in choppy seas, the repeated near misses of drawing water into the diesel intakes, and the constant threat of Allied radar meant that the crew operated under an almost unbearable, continuous, high-alert status. During this initial, harrowing phase, the sheer technical logistics were overwhelming. The boat's purification system, the rudimentary chemical absorbers designed to scrub CO2 from the atmosphere, had a finite capacity. The men were forced into strict, almost catatonic inactivity to lower their metabolic rate and oxygen consumption. Documented, quote, from a later account by Commander Scheffer describing the atmosphere. The worst was the dampness. It was not merely water, it was the entire ocean trying to seep through the hull. Every piece of clothing, every blanket, every piece of paper was soft, mildewed, and heavy. The air itself had weight. We breathed water, not air. The journey south was a meticulous record of agonizingly slow progress. May 10th, May 27th, 1945, the 17-day dive. Evasion of the European cordon. Distance covered, approximately 1,200 nautical miles, mostly at a painful 2 to 3 knots. The crew's skin began to break out in deep, persistent tropical sores caused by the humidity and lack of sunlight. The only form of light was the blood-red bulb in the control room, casting a pallor of sickness over every face. June 1945, entering the mid-Atlantic Gap, the crossing of the most dangerous and desolate stretch. This is where the long-form rhythm of the documentary narration must settle into the monotony of the boat, reflecting the slow passage of time. The script lingers on the rhythmic charging of the batteries, the brief, agonizing moments when the snorkel engine sputtered, threatening to flood the entire compartment. Narrator: the logbook of U-977 is a document of profound mathematical tedium. It records not triumphs, but temperatures. It notes not engagements, but degrees of latitude gained. Each day was a mirror image of the last. Charge batteries, run silent on electric power, raise snorkel, snorkel engine roars. The air briefly, momentarily, freshens. Then the engines stop, and the slow, inevitable poisoning of the air begins again. This was the anti-war, a war fought not against an enemy ship, but against the unyielding chemical physics of deep-sea survival. It was a test of the vessel's hull integrity, but more so, of the human mind's ability to withstand sensory deprivation and chemical toxicity. The U-boat became a floating, sealed laboratory of human psychological breakdown, and in that breakdown, the symbolic fantasy of the outside world took root. The thought of the orange marmalade became a ritual. It wasn't about the fruit, it was the color, the bright, defiant gold and orange, a shade of light they hadn't seen for weeks, a color that promised sunshine and warmth, a world of open spaces and fresh, sea-salted air. Transformation, the abandonment of ideology. The men who sailed from Norway were National Socialists, or at the very least, men entirely committed to the Wehrmacht concept of soldierly duty. They were fleeing, yes, but they were doing so with their weapons intact, ready to fight if intercepted. Their internal identity was German sailor, servant of the Reich. The journey south, especially the crossing of the equator in the middle of July, enacted a profound, slow-motion transformation. The catalyst for this change was the simple, undeniable fact of statelessness. They were operating outside the law of the sea, outside the law of their own defeated nation, and outside the laws of the victors. The ideological framework that had defined their lives, the pride in the Kriegsmarine, the belief in the thousand-year Reich, could not survive the daily reality of their desperate, unacknowledged flight. The ultimate moment of testing came not from the sight of an enemy ship, but from a persistent, desperate rumor that began to circulate through the cramped boat, that they were not fleeing for asylum, but that they were carrying a secret, vital cargo. The rumor, the one that would later justify the massive international scrutiny of the U-977 upon its arrival, was that they were transporting Adolf Hitler, or a high-ranking member of the Inner Circle, to safety in South America. Narrator. The rumor was a psychological survival mechanism. It gave their futile journey a purpose. It elevated their suffering from a selfish escape to a mission of supreme national importance. But even as the men clung to this desperate possibility, the physical realities of the boat chipped away at the core of their fanaticism. How could they believe in the purity of the master race when their own faces were sickly yellow from lack of sun, their skin covered in abscesses from the humidity, and their minds clouded by oxygen starvation? The rigid order of the Kriegsmarine began to disintegrate. Discipline was maintained by Schäfer's iron will, but the reason for that discipline had vanished. When the boat finally surfaced for extended periods after crossing the most heavily patrolled zones, the sun felt like an alien pressure on their eyes. Their uniforms were threadbare and moldy. They were no longer soldiers of the Third Reich. They were simply men of the sea, marooned in their steel shell. The transformation was from ideological servant to human fugitive. They were shedding the weight of the regime, not through conscious rebellion, but through the brute, unrelenting attrition of physical misery. The symbolic orange marmalade shifted in meaning here. It was no longer just the taste of the enemy's abundance. It became the taste of a future where survival, not dogma, was the only currency. The marmalade represented the simple, materialistic comforts that their ideology had forced them to forego, and which now they desperately craved as simple, living men. The South Atlantic and the final approach. The final leg of the journey was the traverse of the South Atlantic, a cold, empty expanse that seemed to stretch into eternity. This was the long, slow, downward curve of the emotional arc, the realization that the grand adventure was merely a prolonged endurance test. The crew was sustained by the technical mastery of their young commander, Heinz Schäfer, who maintained a facade of military certainty even as his own purpose eroded. Historical evidence. The boat's engineering was pushed to extreme limits. For 53 days after the initial 17-day dive, U-977 conducted a rigorous regime of surface snorkel charging and brief, cautious surface runs, but remained submerged for the vast majority of the time. The accumulated time submerged, over 66 days in total, had irrevocably altered the boat's delicate ecosystem. The sound that had haunted them for 2 months was the persistent, low-frequency hum of their own cooling fans, running continuously to draw air over the massive battery racks and dissipate the heat generated during recharging. Narrator: It was the sound of a mechanical heart beating in the deep, a metallic cyclical drone that became the background music to their madness. They learned to sleep through the sound of a failing air scrubber, but they could never truly silence the endless internal monologue of the machinery keeping them alive. As they neared the Argentine coast, Scheffer ordered the remaining torpedoes, the last vestiges of their war-fighting identity, to be fired harmlessly into the empty ocean. Then, the most definitive act of self-cleansing, the destruction of all remaining Kriegsmarine papers, codes, and documents. U-977 was scrubbing its identity. On August 17, 1945, a full 85 days after leaving Norway, the boat finally surfaced completely near the mouth of the Rio de la Plata. The final hours were surreal. The crew, haggard and spectral, cleaned the boat. They tried to restore the pristine order of the Kriegsmarine to the moldering interior, but the attempt was futile. They looked out at the world, a world of light, of vast blue sky, and of freedom, and realized they were strangers. They were met, not by a triumphant reception, but by the quiet, methodical professionalism of the Argentine Navy. The surrender was not dramatic. It was procedural. The Great Escape ended, not in glory, but in a transfer of custody. The men who stepped onto the pier at Mar del Plata were no longer the proud sailors of the Reich. They were gaunt, bewildered figures in tattered, damp uniforms, carrying only the indelible stain of their extended confinement. Epilogue: The cost of the longest dive. The story of U-977's flight to Argentina became a footnote in history, a subject of conspiracy theories and brief, intense Allied investigation. They searched the boat for hidden documents, for Hitler, for gold, finding only the evidence of extreme physical hardship and technical determination. But the true story lies not in the boat's cargo, but in the psychological wreckage of its crew. The 85 days of self-imposed exile, the 66 days spent suffocating beneath the surface, were more than just a naval record. They were a journey away from the rigid certitude of a dead ideology and toward the complex, bewildering reality of freedom. The orange marmalade, the unattainable taste of easy sweetness, represents the luxury of a democratic society, the ability to exist without existential scarcity, without the grinding daily sacrifice mandated by a totalitarian state. The crew of U-977 had sailed from the darkness of ideological servitude into the uncertain sunlight of the post-war world. They had given up their pride, their past, and their identity to pursue a theoretical freedom in a neutral land. And in that protracted, agonizing dive, they proved a chilling truth, that the ultimate enemy of the totalitarian mind is not an opposing army, but the raw, unadorned experience of physical existence, divorced from all higher purpose. They arrived as refugees, not heroes. They traded the claustrophobia of a U-boat for the terrifying immensity of a world they no longer belonged to. Their voyage stands as a testament not to the failure of their engine, but to the crushing, inescapable pressure of reality, a pressure that, over time, can crack the strongest ideological hull. The sea, vast and indifferent, had stripped them bare, leaving behind only the simple, universal truth. Survival is the first law, and abundance, whether of air or of simple sweet fruit, is the deepest form of freedom.